This is about the third time of me going back to the house and getting what I needed to get. And went back to the house, forgot my microphone, and then I had to forgot the wire for the microphone, and then I ended up forgetting the SD card. So I went back a total of 3 times to go get what I needed. And luckily we finally got what we needed. So let's hope this works out in one shot. Starting with one of the latest things I've been reading called Outliers. In a nutshell, it's talking about attaining success and what it actually takes, and whether or not it's an environmental factor or a factor of plain out hard work. What I have come to conclude out of reading this is that it is a 50-50, but it goes obviously much more deeper into that. I guess you could say it is, in a sense, 100%. Success is dependent on 100% luck, and I know that that is a big statement to say. Even though I originally said that perhaps it's 50% luck and 50% of actual hard work. Now, the reason why I say that is because in order for you to attain the ability, I wouldn't say the ability, but definitely feel the need and develop a strong work ethic, is luck dependent in the sense that it is either something installed in you through environmental factors that could be as something as simple as watching YouTube videos that are motivational when you were a kid, or having parents that are hardworking. In fact, they had a whole chapter on that, attributed to that, which was, I think it was the 10,000 hour rule, chapter 2. But in a sense, it basically talked about how, well, the 10,000 hour rule was a little bit more different, I'd say. But the start of the conversation is that for you to be able to work hard on a particular thing is luck dependent, in the sense that, one, you need to have that sort of need and fiery sort of passion in you built up through something else. Again, such as YouTube videos. Maybe you, as you were a kid, you were watching YouTube videos. Or, again, parents as well, if you have parents that were hardworking. But the other factor that comes into play is that, okay, now you have the passion to work hard. Do you have the time? And obviously that goes into play where if you take on a scale of the Graham bell curve, which is basically the curve that goes at kind of like a little bump in the middle. Obviously you have the main section. The main section is majority of the population. As you start to grow out, you get towards the, I'd say the outliers. And so the proposition in this 10,000 hour rule chapter is that in order for you to put in those 10,000 hours is also luck dependent. In order for you to have the time necessary to put in those 10,000 hours is also luck dependent. Now, obviously, this can be accomplished over the course of many years, but for people such as athletes that maybe are in the NBA, for people such as Bill Gates. Bill Gates was a very prime example in this book. The noticeable trend for these outliers is that, well, they're outliers to begin with because they have attained success at a very high level, and not just at a very high level, but at a very early age. And that goes the same for a lot of NBA players. They get into the NBA early on and they become stars. And then, you have people like Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan, that LeBron James, that when they came onto the scene and they came on relatively at an early age. Kobe Bryant, I don't know so much about NBA, but I do know that Kobe Bryant and LeBron James did not go to college. Now, I could be wrong about that, but the fact that they were able to be so good at such a young age goes back to the 10,000 hour rule in the sense that they were able to put those 10,000 hours in early on. Now, if you take somebody that is coming from a different background where their parents might have been not so disciplined, and the kid's not so lucky enough to have gone down a road where they discovered their passions early on and had the necessary time allotted to them to be able to put in those hours, you can start to see how that becomes a less lucky environment than that of somebody starting out. Now, this is a very interesting book because it teeters on the fence of whether or not success is luck dependent or hard work dependent. I know for many people that they would have 2 points of views. When we take a look at these 2 points of views, one is that it's all hard work, that you create your own luck because you work hard. And then you have the other side of the coin, which is, well, in order for you to work hard and have the time allotted and have the resources available to you requires luck. If we take Bill Gates, for example, prime example was, when he went to college, all he focused on was really programming. And so his skills developed because he was able to put in countless hours into becoming a better programmer. And not only that, I believe he had this book talked about it, which was that he had a very skilled mentor that was able to guide him. And so when we start to take a look into how much luck plays a role into success, it is how should I say? We can agree that it's of course inevitable that luck comes into play for success. But when we start to get into which comes first, the luck or the hard work, that proves to be that makes for a pretty interesting discussion. And so this is basically what the first whole part of the book talked about. And so when we get into chapter 1 with Outliers, one of the biggest topics was actually about hockey players. And I'm sorry if I butcher this, I'm not a hockey player. I live in Hawaii. It is warm out. Right now it is 75 degrees, I want to say. So nothing in terms of near Canada or any other northern states where hockey is a big thing. But they talked about how the timing of evaluation for younger players who might be, I don't know, somewhere, this is a really rough estimate, I can't remember the number in my head, but around the ages of like 10 through 15 or something like that. But the timing of the evaluation happens at, I believe, around December. Now, during this time, you have these organizations that go out and they try to recruit some of the best players that are out there, right? And so they'll go to different institutions, different schools, take a look at the kids, how they play, whether or not they have potential. But the big thing about this that is luck dependent is the timing of the evaluation. And the reason why is because when you are, let's say you're 10 years old and you just turned 10 years old in January. Compare that to a 9-year-old who maybe doesn't turn 10 until let's say December, somewhere in December, but the evaluation happens before that date, suddenly you have a very big gap of let's take a look at this a different way. I actually forgot what some of the things were said, and I can't remember exactly what the scenario was, so I think it's better I don't BS myself and dig myself in a hole. So okay. And there are a lot more specific examples that go into play. Another example is, generally we know that there's timing around people that got big when the internet was growing, as well as, I think another prime example for me was people that were growing big when YouTube was growing. YouTubers who were growing big when YouTube was growing, who just so happened to be at the right time to be able to continue to put out content at scale without needing to necessarily, and I don't want to discredit them, but there isn't much of a need to make yourself super unique. And needing to work tirelessly smarter than other people. If you take YouTube right now, the competition or the threshold to get in as a fairly big YouTuber is very high. And so you need to put a lot of work into separating yourself. Now compare that to the beginning of YouTube is obviously completely different. So that's another factor of luck that comes into play. That's not just with YouTubers. It goes into play with, people that were at the dawn of the internet age, so on and so forth. So we're gonna try to find this here. I hope I can find it fast because I actually read this book like, I don't know, I want to say 2 months back, I think. I'm on a different book right now, but I'm trying to experiment with this sort of speaking out loud about my thoughts because I feel like it makes for a pretty interesting conversation. And a lot of times, the conclusions that I come to are not actual conclusions at all. They are open-ended discussions that continue in my mind, and the conclusions that I come to are just understandings of new perspectives from two sides of the coin. And well, that proves to be especially true with the current book I'm reading, which hopefully I can soon get to. I'm actually almost done with it. But yeah, I figured I'd start with this book first because, this was pretty huge. So we're getting into timing now. And so if we start with here, the Canadian Hockey League, which in turn is the finest junior hockey league in the world. These were the future stars of the sport, 17, 18, and 19 years old, who had been skating, shooting pucks since they were barely more than toddlers. And then it goes on here. That if we take a closer look at the roster of the 2000 Medicine Hat Tigers, I hope I read that right. I did. It says Medicine. But it goes into the birth dates. Actually, I can probably show it. But you'll notice that all of these birth dates are around January, December. The earlies, February, you got a few in May. Majority of them in January. And actually only one in December. So you got March, few Aprils. Right. Is this backwards? I hope to God this ain't backwards. If it is, that's unfortunate. So anyway, the idea is that the explanation for this is quite simple. It has nothing to do with astrology, nor is there anything magical about the first 3 months of the year. It's simply that in Canada, the eligibility cutoff for age class hockey is January 1st. That's the cutoff date, right? A boy who turns 10 on January 2nd then could be playing alongside someone who doesn't turn 10 until the end of the year. And at that age, in pre-adolescence, a 12-month gap in age represents an enormous difference in physical maturity, right? So they're the same age, right? But they turn 10 at completely different times. One closer to the beginning of the year, one closer to the end of the year. And when you're at that point in time of being a child, the amount of growth that ensues from that early age is dramatically greater. And so timing is one thing, the environment is another. Culture, timing obviously in terms of what we talked about earlier with people like Bill Gates or like YouTubers, the example of that that I ended up pulling out of my ass. And then the example of the Canadian Little League here. Then there's the environment. They went into actually talking about particular, they got into ethnicity and culture, which was pretty interesting. For ethnicity and people coming from, I'd say, immigrating descents, obviously tended to have harder work ethics. For children that came from parents that immigrated into the United States, who the parents then had ambitions to try to open up some sort of business, ended up being people that worked a lot harder. That was one of the statements that were there. The example that they used was lawyers. They were actually, I can't remember the time frame, it might have been around the late 1900s, where there were a lot of, I'd say predominantly, there was a predominant class of people that became lawyers. And so the people that had immigrated parents that obviously weren't of Caucasian background, or sorry, white ethnicity, ended up being outliers in this case. And eventually through also timing, because they could not work on the main sort of cases, the main types of cases that other companies were doing, they decided to go off and do the uncanny ones, the ones that many people didn't want to. And it just so happened that as time went along, eventually there came a period where these different sort of uncanny cases that these immigrants were working on became the big demand for these bigger institutions. And so suddenly the little businesses that these lawyers that were outliers ended up creating ended up becoming a lot greater. And grew to, I think, was pretty big. It's pretty big. Now, culturally, this was the most interesting one because I recently went to Korea. And in Korea, you get exposure to a completely different culture. And what I started to realize after a while is that it's not just about the way people talk, the way people greet each other. That's different when you have people from two cultural backgrounds meeting. It's also the ability to connect. There is, on one hand, if you're meeting somebody that has been exposed to different cultures, that's a connecting point because, you feel the emotion of adapting to something totally new, a totally different environment, and being sort of like forced to adapt in that sense becomes that connecting point because you share sort of that same, I want to say it's not really pain, but it's the same growing pain, I categorize it, right? On the other hand, if you meet somebody else that is from a totally different cultural background, but that hasn't really had the exposure of seeing other, getting exposed to different cultures, there's sort of a disconnect there. Because now there's I don't want to say absolutely, but there is a very big gap of connection between the way you grew up and the way the other person grew up. And a prime example of this is, for me, I'm born and raised in Hawaii, in America. And that is a cultural background and context that I've been given. Now, at the same time, my mom is Korean, she's from Korea. And so there is sort of a bit of a history there in terms of being exposed to a different cultural way of being brought up. Now, if you go into Korea, there's no exposure to the way Americans grew up. And so, there's that point where obviously given the choice between connecting with somebody from Korea versus somebody from your native land, you are more likely to connect with that person from your native land because of, and this is the key pointer, it's not to say that you can't connect with somebody. I'm not trying to make a statement here. You can't connect with somebody that is from Korea. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. And that's probably far from it. But make no mistake that there is a bigger gap, an obvious gap. Now, why am I saying this? Well, because now, depending on where you've been grown up and brought up, in the cultural context will change how that now changes how companies are put together, right? And so this makes for a very interesting case that the book brought up, which was an incident with the Korean Airlines that ended up having frequent accidents happening. And in a nutshell, Korean Air became they were tagged as very dangerous during that time and unsafe. But when analysts start to take a look at what was actually going on in the big picture, it turned out to be a cultural difference. In Korea, there is a hierarchy in which elders earn or are supposed to earn more respect from the younger people, the younger generations, compared to that of America. And it changes because it's also in the language as well. You see that evident in the language. There are different ways to talk to people depending on what their status is in this sort of hierarchy. So if they're older than you, you're talking differently than if you were to talk to somebody that's younger from you. Now, obviously, in this generational period, there's a bit of a discrepancy. There's a bit of a conflict going on in Korea. But to stay on topic, what they found was because of this hierarchy difference, when you have a pilot and the co-pilot sitting in the chair, the pilot, might have a lot more experience, but also might be a little bit more comfortable, right? And when you have the co-pilot, they might be a little bit more aware of what's going on, maybe checking things. And so when the co-pilot finds that there is something wrong, there needs to be a respective way to communicate that to the pilot. And if the pilot ends up disagreeing or feels that the co-pilot is trying to sort of be more of a know-it-all, if the pilot gets that sense from the co-pilot, then there was also the cultural background the pilot would end up criticizing the co-pilot for acting that way, even though the co-pilot might have been right. And so, long story short, how did they fix it? They got somebody that was from a Western background to change the operations of Korean Air. And in a nutshell, because English is a universal language for airports all over the country, it became the main language that pilots and flight attendants would speak in. And so now the entire system's in English. And because of that, the way they address each other is now on a lot more equal planes. And they're a lot more comfortable giving suggestions about certain errors that might come up and having a full conversation, right? Now, if you take a direct contrast to that, that's New York, right? So New Yorkers are known for being a lot more upfront and personal, which is, I'm not putting this in a bad light, right? It's every single way of communicating has its, goods and bads, right? Positives and negatives. But when pilots go to an airport in New York, the air traffic control is on it. So if there's something wrong, they're gonna tell it to you straight up. I've got to find this one incident, but it was kind of a humorous thing that came up where the book came up with an example that a pilot ended up coming across a female air traffic control, and the air traffic control person started getting so agitated by what the pilot was doing. And so she ended up saying, "Don't move, stay where you're at, and don't speak to me until I tell you to." And then the pilot ends up responding, "Ma'am, have we met in a later life before?" I thought that was pretty funny. But it goes to show the cultural difference that also comes into play. And so when we come back into the discussion of whether or not success is dependent on hard work or... I totally did not just run out of memory in the middle of recording this. But if we come back to the conversation of whether or not luck is dependent on hard work, let me rephrase that. If we come back to the conversation of whether or not success is dependent on luck or hard work, I see both sides of the coin. And I think it is being able to see both sides of the coin in much clearer vision that allows for much more clearer decision making. And so the recommendation that I now have, and that I feel that most people should give in terms of advice, is, and I say this because I don't believe giving unsolicited advice is something you should ever do. But in the case that you are asked, what should I do in order to become successful? The first foundational thing that I think should happen is to see both sides of the coin, that success is both, that it can be very luck dependent and very success dependent, very luck dependent and very hard work dependent, and that hard work and luck are intertwined. You can't have one without the other. They work in sync to create the progress. And so when you do that, I think it becomes a lot more understanding when somebody tells you to just focus on the things that you can control, and to put yourself in better positions so that luck can ensue in order to give you much more opportunities at chasing and attaining success. So yeah, that was pretty much the book in a nutshell. I hope I tried my best to not go too much into the specifics because I don't remember it. But in terms of, the specific stories, and I didn't want to say something wrong that I might have remembered wrong, which is why I kept some things general. But hopefully the next book that we go over will be a little bit different. I don't know whether or not this will be book by book or something I break chapter by chapter. I'm just kind of going by overarching thoughts that I might end up having and sort of making that the title. But yeah, that's pretty much it in a nutshell.